pleasure and the human function. Let's take stock of where we are in our study of Aristotle's ethics. The central question of ethics, in Aristotle's view, is what is the goal of life? A preliminary, uncontroversial, but not very informative answer, he tells us, is that the goal of life is to live well or do well. And finally, living well or doing well is living up to the standards for a good life. But what are the standards for leading a good life? This is the question that people disagree about, Aristotle tells us. He gives us his own answer to the question in chapter 7 of book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics. But before that, he criticizes the answers given by others. In order to appreciate the reasons Aristotle gives for his own answer, it will be helpful first to consider his criticism of one of the answers that he thinks is wrong. In chapter 5, he surveys and discusses a number of different proposals about what eudaimonia, or living well, consists in. I want to draw your attention to what he has to say against those who propose that happiness, that is, living well, is simply living pleasantly. In other words, this is the thesis that pleasure is the goal of life. Aristotle's criticism of this proposal is short and sweet. A life organized around the pursuit of pleasure befits an animal, not a human being. He here betrays an assumption that will be very important in developing his own position, that the standards for living well will be the standards for living a good human life. Now, in rejecting pleasure as the goal of life, Aristotle isn't saying that we shouldn't pursue pleasure. He thinks, like most people, that pleasure is a good thing, and that anyone suffering extensive and interminable pain is not living well. Pleasure is part of a good life in his view, but our pursuit of it has to be regulated by some further end, by our adherence to a set of standards that regulate which pleasures we will pursue and which we will forego, in roughly the way that the rules of soccer regulate who gets to touch the ball with their hands and what counts as out of bounds. It's part of our animal nature to pursue pleasure, and it is part of our doing well as animals that our lives be pleasant rather than painful. But we are not just animals, Aristotle insists, and one of the features of the distinctively human pursuit of pleasure is that we forego pleasures that we think are beneath us or forbidden to us, and we endure pain sometimes, rather than violate the standards of conduct we live by. Think of the prisoner bearing up under torture and refusing to tell the secret. So what are the standards that a human being is supposed to live by? That's the question Aristotle thinks we can answer by appealing to what he calls the function, the ergon, of a human being. This is the argument he gives in the second half of chapter 7. Now, it's important not to be misled or distracted by Aristotle's assumption that human beings have a function. He does not mean that they have a creator who made them for a particular purpose. Rather, by the function of a thing, of anything, he means the activity that is distinctive and characteristic of it. The function of a dancer is to dance, the function of a carpenter is to build, the function of a teacher is to teach, and so on. Now, the same person can have many different functions. If Ariadne is a human being, and a dancer, and a teacher, then there won't be a straightforward answer to the question, what is Ariadne's function? Insofar as she is a dancer, her function is to dance. Insofar as she is a teacher, her function is to teach. Insofar as she is a human being, her function is to, well, what is it that human beings do insofar as they are human beings? The possible answers Aristotle considers are all activities of the soul that he's discussed in the De Anima. He's assuming that the characteristic activity of a human being will be an activity of the soul. Well, human beings live, they grow and reproduce, but so do plants. So that can't be the distinctively human activity. Human beings also have sense perception and move about, but so do other animals. So the remaining possibility, Aristotle concludes, is that using reason is the distinctively human activity. When we are doing what humans do, insofar as they are human, we use our powers of thought and reason. With this understanding of the human function in hand, Aristotle now thinks he can give a more informative specification of what living well consists in. This is the stretch of reasoning known as the function argument. Here's the basic strategy of the argument. The guiding assumption is that living well, or doing well for a human being, will consist in doing well what human beings do, insofar as they are human. We've just seen that this is to exercise reason. So, doing well for a human being will be a matter of using reason well, just as doing well for a dancer will be dancing well, and doing well for a teacher will be teaching well. Now, to exercise reason well is to exercise virtue, or excellence, of reason. So doing well for a human being will be to exercise distinctively human excellence, that is, the virtue of reason. We can summarize the argument as follows. 1. Living well for a human being consists in doing well what human beings do insofar as they are human. Step 2. What human beings do insofar as they are human is to use reason. 3. To use reason well is to exercise virtue, or excellence, of reason. 4. So, living well for a human being is to exercise virtue of reason. Or, as our translation puts it, the human good turns out to be the soul's activity that expresses virtue, where we have to understand virtue of reason. Now, in drawing the connection here between living well, or happiness on the one hand, and virtue, or excellence, on the other hand, Aristotle isn't saying anything very startling or novel. Recall Meno and even Thrasymachus, who don't need an argument to convince them to pursue virtue, which they take to be greatness in life. But Aristotle's conception of what human virtue consists in is, if not entirely novel, still very different from the ideal that Meno and Thrasymachus endorse. Recall that Meno and Thrasymachus take virtue to consist in the ability to rule or dominate other people. Aristotle, by contrast, takes the domain of virtue to be the exercise of reason. It is not by exercising power and dominance that one achieves greatness as a human being, Aristotle implies, but by cultivating and perfecting one's powers of reasoning. Thus, Aristotle is firmly on the side of Socrates, who contends in the Apology that the most important thing in life, to which one should direct one's utmost attention, is to care for the state of one's soul. That virtue is a state of a person's soul is the signal contribution that Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle make to the contemporary debate about virtue.